Evening, everybody. Welcome to Unbiased America Live. We're here with our regular panel. We have Mike Lee to my left down there. He has his little name tag, as you can see. We have Kevin Ryan, who looks like he's wearing the baseball cap from the Sandlot with the really long brim. He probably has just as many friends as that kid does as well. We have our special guest with us, David Shestokas, who is the author of Constitutional Soundbites. He was also the host of Constitutionally Speaking, which was a radio program in the Chicago area. Am I right?
No, it was in Tampa and Southwest
Florida. I'm sorry,
for
Florida.
3 years. I was practicing law down there. Go ahead.
Okay, and he also, ran for Congress in 1990 as the Republican nominee, and again in 1998, but lost in the primary to the eventual Republican winner there. I wanted to start off. This week I'm doing a constitutional series on Unbiased America and our other little page, Being Constitutional, which is an offshoot. And I get at this question a lot, and from my parents who have been lifelong kind of moderate establishment Republicans, can go JFK Democrats. I get, the Constitution's an old document. It needs to change, and today in the 21st century we need to be more flexible. Why is the Constitution still important? Why is what the framers said and did? Why does that still matter?
Well, in the first instance, Will, thank you very much for having me on Unbiased America. I'm really happy to be here joining you and your panel. And I'm going to answer your question after I ask the first question that I always ask whenever I begin either a presentation or a talk. And this is a question that only 1 in 1,000 Americans know the answer to, and every American should. Can any of the three of you name the 5 rights in the First Amendment?
Ah, that's a good one. You guys want to try it?
Yeah, give me a second.
Freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, free exercise, and oh gosh, what's the other one?
There's 5.
Yeah, there's one more. This is hard to do when you. What did I say now? Free exercise, freedom of religion, freedom of association.
We'll call religion. Religion is number 1.
Can I take a guess?
Sure.
I can't think of it.
Okay. Freedom of religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly.
Petition. Sorry, innocent. Yeah.
Thank you, Google.
Somehow it looked like you were reading something. And there's a interesting tale. There's a cautionary tale on that. The last one, almost nobody can name, and that's petition for redress of grievances.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and petition for redress of grievances actually was very, very important, which is why it ranked among the 5 that are in the First Amendment. And petition for redress of grievances didn't just mean writing letters, sending emails saying, what do you guys think? It actually, the legislature had a duty to take your suggestions, send it to committee, and entertain it as law and give it an up or down vote. And in the period running up to the Civil War, there were a lot of petitions coming into Congress, and the Democrats actually imposed a gag rule and say we're not going to do any petitions anymore because they got tired of all the petitions for getting rid of slavery. And it's a cautionary tale because it's one of the first 5 rights in the Bill of Rights, and it's gone. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely gone. That's why nobody can name it, because we lost it.
Wasn't that also in the Declaration of Independence? That same phrase. The consent.
Petition to government for redress of grievances. We have humbly petitioned the king for redress of our grievances.
Yeah. I use it quite a bit.
And so just to get off to why is it relevant, I'll tell you what, that's an answer to your question, because we've lost one. We've absolutely lost one because people didn't know it existed, and they allowed the Congress to do away with it because it got to be a pain. And so why is it relevant? We can lose all of them if we consider it to be irrelevant. It's timeless and it's universal.
I guess that started the ball rolling down the hill because nobody cares about the 9th or 10th Amendments either. Those are gone, completely gone, in my opinion. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I don't have any objection to that. Well, fortunately, there's a few people out there, among them Senator Cruz, talking about the Ninth and Tenth Amendments these days, and the importance of them. And the Ninth and Tenth Amendments are, in fact, crucial. Although, of course, they're modified somewhat by some of the Civil War amendments by the 14th. They don't carry the same power as they did when they originally passed, but they didn't modify them completely.
I think a lot of people don't really know even what the Constitution's purpose was. Was the Constitution a document that gave the federal government power, or was it a document that restricted their power?
Both. The answer to that question is both. But in the book, I think what people don't look at often enough, or ignore, or forget, is the Declaration of Independence. I find, in fact, that the Constitution was put together to execute the promise of the Declaration of Independence, the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the promise of the inalienable rights. That's what the Constitution. That was the real purpose of the Constitution. Ultimately, was to execute the promise of the Declaration of Independence.
They really should be read together. I mean, I always say the Ninth and Tenth Amendments really should be read together, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were really meant to be read together. I think they should be intertwined, yet they really never are.
Well, that's why the book starts with the Declaration of Independence, and then it has 3 different sections that deal successively with elements of the Constitution, but each section opens up with thoughts on the Declaration of Independence and talks about how even Article 1 relates to the Declaration of Independence, how the issues of the president relate to the grievances against King John, how the Bill of Rights are meant to execute life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People overlook the Declaration of Independence. If you want to find meaning in the Constitution, find the timeless and universal concepts that you find in the Declaration.
But aren't these things written by a bunch of old white slave owners in the 18th century? Why does that matter today? I mean, we have such a progressive society, right? We have computers now. We have, TV. We have MSNBC. Why do we need the Constitution?
Well, for the most part, these theoretically old guys were on the average in their 40s, in their early 40s.
Oh, that is ancient. Oh.
And I know that's ancient. But as it turns out, Governor Morris, who actually penned the final draft of the Constitution, he's actually the one responable for the
and he wrote the
organization.
preamble, by the way, at the very last minute. Yes.
He rewrote the preamble in a very important way. But Governor Morris, when he wrote the preamble and the Constitution, was 35. Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, was 33.
Boy, I really got to do something with my life here, David. You're making me feel badly.
Oh, when I give a talk, I have a PowerPoint with Jefferson, 33, Morris, 35. I didn't even get to law school till I was 33, Oh,
now I feel better. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I felt, I felt like quite a bit of an underachiever when I talk about some of these guys and what they did at their age. And by the way, relative to the old white guys, there was one old white guy,
Ben Franklin. There he is. But these guys, David, they were slaveholders. I mean, here they are violating the natural law that they're expressly writing about, right? I mean, wasn't the 3/5 clause about, dehumanizing the slaves and subjugating them to this white patriarchy that so many people are talking about?
I so often, when that question comes up, try to defer to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass being the fugitive slave abolitionist that became a huge speaker around the country leading up to and after the Civil War, and his writing about how the Constitution ultimately was an anti-slavery document. I can point out to several points. One is they specifically gave the Congress the ability to get rid of international slave trade in 1808. 2, under the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance was passed that banned slavery in what was then the Northwest Territory, everything north of the Ohio River that became Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan, and a small part of Minnesota. But they did that in 1787. And then when wrote the Constitution, they gave Congress the power to do what was necessary in the territories. And that one of the very first acts in 1789 that the first Congress did after the Constitution was passed was, in fact, to reenact the Northwest Ordinance banning slavery north of the Ohio River. So they gave a lot of authority to them that was on slavery. And Morris, by the way, you can also find that while they may have made a deal with the devil, if you might, to create a country, but you also don't find the word slavery anywhere in the Constitution. And that was on purpose so that the term and the concept of slavery was not constitutionalized, so that future generations would be in a position to, in fact, do away with it.
Okay, so you got me on that. It's not racist. Okay, I'll give you that. I'll give you that. But what about misogynistic? I mean, here you have, they never outlined that women can vote. They never specifically mention women. Is it? I mean, didn't these guys want to subjugate their mothers, their daughters, their wives to the state by not allowing them to vote? I mean, isn't what happened to universal right to vote?
Well, of course, when the Constitution was written, the rights to voting was controlled entirely by the states and things that were established. But the Constitution, if you might note, is gender neutral. It is not gender positive or negative. There's no place that in fact, and that's another thing about the change in language, of course. Even as you're much younger than I, but most people that learned to proper English in maybe 30 years ago or so had a situation where they understood that the masculine pronouns meant everybody. Because
so all men are created equal isn't inherently misogynistic, because a lot of my political science teachers say that it is.
No, it's certainly not. It's not misogynistic. There's no question about it. Because I have.
It's hard to ask these with a straight face, David. So I'm trying here.
You're trying to be.
I'm being devil's advocate.
Okay, all right, but it's not, and it's not. Neither is it racist, nor is it. You know, it's very interesting that they specifically talked about no religious test for office, but they also never said that in a time when quite regularly people had to be property owners to run for office at the state level, there was no such requirement. In fact, such a requirement was voted down to be a property owner in running for Congress. There was no gender requirements, there was no racial requirements, there were no property requirements. Mm-hmm. The Constitution was written to be universal and timeless.
So, my question next is, why is it, if it was good enough then, and these attitudes in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, but we're in the 21st century here now, and the Constitution is very hard to change. It's not as malleable as some would like. So why? What can we do about that? I mean, is it, we need it to change, right? Why did they make it so difficult to do that?
Well, we have to start out with the concept first that the Constitution is law. Do we agree that the Constitution is law?
Well, their law. I mean, the old white guy's law. Why is it our law today?
They gave us the ability to change it.
Mm-hmm.
They gave us the ability to change it. And is it difficult? Yeah, it was meant to be difficult. On the other hand, of course, it would not be. Otherwise, it wouldn't be what? It wouldn't be an organic document if it was easy to change. And
so it is law. So what you're saying is the Constitution created, say, federal bodies like the Senate and Congress. I mean, if we can change anything about it, why don't we just get rid of Congress on a whim? Or how, if it's not law, then why would anything matter?
It doesn't. It wouldn't if it's not law. There is no. I mean, there is no. If it's changeable or a quote living document, then there is no law. We are in fact lawless.
Right.
So you have to
go ahead.
Start
I'm sorry.
with that. No, you have to start with that premise that in fact the document is the law that sets the society's rules. Mm-hmm. And if you want to, there's a mechanism to change it, or of course, I talk often about a raucous debate, 1787 to 1789. That was really the birth of free speech during the ratification debates. But it was really different when it came to the Declaration of Independence. Nobody took a vote on it. I mean, they didn't pass a general plebiscite. Basically, you had a couple of choices. You could support the Declaration, you could shut up, or you could leave. Was basically the situation with the Declaration of Independence. Why? Well, there was 30,000 British troops on the way. They had to do something. So the Constitution was really the birth of free speech and participation. When you talk about the bunch of rich old white guys, a couple of things. It was important to them when the Constitution was founded that they achieved the consent of the government when the Constitution was ratified and proposed. One of the things that they went about doing that was, even though there were property requirements to vote, generally speaking, in most of the states, for the ratification convention, for the adoption of the Constitution, property requirements were waived. At that particular point in time, to that date in history, it was the most inclusive vote and participation of any country establishing anything in the history of mankind.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, just to get on from playing devil's advocate, Constitution.
Yeah, I know it's going to be tough because we agree on so much.
Yeah, I know it's hard for me to do, but these are I'm in political science, or I was in political science. I have my degree in political science, and I hear these constantly repeated by not the students, but the teachers. I mean, more specifically, generally they latch on to the old rich white men. And the 3/5 clause is purposely dehumanizing that this was a state, a country based on racism, and then they try to tie, going back to Christopher Columbus, that this country was based on racism, and they bring in their cultural and moral relativism, that Indian genocide by white people. I mean, they really are desperately trying, this historical revisionism, most in academia first, and then the talking heads, these intellectuals on TV, just repeat these mantras and never provide an argument. And it's almost, I had a teacher, these guys have PhDs. It's a 5-second Google search to figure out exactly what you elucidated, and that that the Constitution was this restrictive document that tried to restrict slavery, and what Frederick Douglass said is that it was this, it was a scaffolding that was erected that that once you abolish slavery, the Constitution still stands. There was anything to do with slavery in the Constitution. So I just don't know why these things still go on. I can't figure it out. But I want to get the guys in here to ask some questions before we get into the nuts and bolts. I know they're going to have some questions that the viewers are going to want to hear. So Kevin, why don't you go first, and then we'll get Mike in here.
Sure. Well, first I want to know what's your opinion on replacing Scalia. I mean, obviously, there's a divide in America right now, and some people want to see him replaced right now, especially with the pick that it seems to be a moderate choice, at least according to some people, rather than wait until possibly having Hillary do it. Or, obviously the Congress, the Republicans in Congress are hoping that a conservative will be elected and will put somebody in, like a Scalia in. Where do you come down on this issue?
From my personal standpoint, and this is personal. It's not really a constitutional question. Well, there are two constitutional issues. One is, does the president obviously have a right to do this and make an appointment at this point in time? Of course he does. He's the president until the end of his term. He's not elected for 3.5 years. He's elected for 4 years. So when there's a vacancy, the Constitution allows him to make a nomination. In the second instance, does the Senate have an obligation to give him a hearing on that? No, they do not. They have the absolute right to advise or consent as they please. From my personal standpoint, I think it's bad politics. I think it's I think the Republican leadership could have taken the high road and said, we're going to give whoever the president nominates a fair hearing, and we'll give him a vote if we think that he's not appropriate at this time for whatever reason. And of course, the Constitution doesn't say you have to or a senator has to give a reason. He might just not like the guy's politics or the general philosophy. I think it would have been politically smart for them to say, yeah, we're all for fairness, and give them a hearing and give them an up or down vote. I don't think that, so they're taking a danger, and I understand the whole 4-4 divide and the situation for about the generations to come and what Senator Cruz is talking about, and I understand those things. Do I think the Republican leadership and the position taken generally by the Republican Party is bad politics? Yeah, I think they would have been better off to go ahead and indicate that they would in fact give a fair hearing in the interest of the country.
Kevin, do you agree?
Yeah, well, actually, I don't want to see a Scalia replaced with a Kagan or something. I want to see another originalist come in there, and there's no chance that's going to happen under Obama. I don't know what Trump would do. There's no chance that would happen under Hillary. I think really the only chance would be if somebody like a Cruz were elected. I mean, I think he would be probably the one guy that I could trust to put in somebody like a Scalia. So I'm hoping. I see exactly what you're saying. The problem is politics. The problem is, I think there's like a 70% of Americans, or 60 or 80%, I don't know the number, but the majority of Americans want the Obama to replace Scalia at this time and not wait.
I don't know if they want Obama to replace him as much as they want to give whoever he nominates, as much as they want to have him have a hearing,
right,
and present the views and get the ups and downs from and subject him to the grilling, et cetera, that could, and have his record scrutinized and criticized publicly.
Yeah.
And I don't know that they necessarily want him to replace him, but do I think that they would have been wise to say, yeah, actually the wise thing would have been for McConnell to do, say, we're going to recognize this great American, and we're not going to talk about politics for the next 2 weeks. We're going to have an appropriate period of mourning, and then they would have had time to probably consider precisely what they're doing.
Yeah, I don't think there was enough time sort of for cooler heads to prevail. I remember when I found out about Scalia passing, my first thought was, oh my God, this is the worst timing ever. And when McConnell came out and said, we're not going to let Obama replace him, essentially, I was kind of relieved. But as the days passed, I recognized that the politics of it just are kind of unseemly. They're a little unseemly, and I think it's probably going to hurt the Republicans more than help them going down, in the election. But we've already seen a 4-4 split coming out on a major issue that
yes.
Scalia would definitely have ruled. He would have the union issue. Just to tell people, there was a case brought up by teachers in California, essentially saying that protesting the fact that they were being required to pay union dues or union fees as a part of a collective negotiating process. And what ended up happening is it was basically going to reverse 40 years of established law, established policy. And if Scalia had been there, he would have been the fifth vote that would have effectively overturned that policy once and for all. And with him not there, it reverts back to the lower court ruling, which keeps it in place. So you're already seeing essentially a major shift in the court right now, and it's probably going to become worse if a liberal gets on there. So, I'm not sure what that means in terms of whether or not we should replace him now or wait till after the election. But if Obama had replaced him now and that they'd given him an upvote, essentially you would have a 5-4, and it would be the same result. It would
Well, no, it would have been a worse result because.
That's true. That's true, because it would have established.
A 4-4 is not precedential.
Right.
All it does is allow all it's precedent for at the moment is the Ninth Circuit,
right.
Allowing the Ninth Circuit decision to stand.
Can that come back up now?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that's not a final decision. That's not a final decision when there's a tie. It just goes back and that stands. But of course, they're going to have to if they wanted to appeal that particular situation, then they're going to have to find a new case. But the question can get back to the Supreme Court. Yes.
Okay, Mike, I know you have a couple questions. Go ahead.
Well, Kevin kind of took a little bit out of what I was going to ask him. That was a really good question. I agree with a lot of what you had to say. Although I do want to point out that I'm not sure if at least maybe the country as a whole, especially independents and Democrats, might think that they want Obama to nominate the next Supreme Court justice or at least give him hearings. But when it comes to conservatives in the Republican Party and the base of this party, I actually disagree. I don't think they want anything to do with it, and they don't care if they're holding hearings. One of the themes that I'm getting, and one of the reasons that there is a Trump, that there's a Ted Cruz, is because people are upset that Republicans aren't standing up to Democrats and Obama like they were elected to do in 2010, like they were elected to do in 2014. So I don't think this hurts Republicans for their core, their base core. I don't think that they really care whether there's hearings or not. I think that they're happy that Republicans in the Senate are taking a stand. So that's one thing I just kind of had a minor disagreement with.
Well, you're accurate regarding the core, but you need more than the core to win an election. You know.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think one of the reasons that Republicans haven't won in 2008 and 2012 in national elections is because they didn't motivate the base to come out. The base didn't want to vote for John McCain. The base didn't want to vote for Mitt Romney. And when you don't have the enthusiasm and the grassroots and the base behind you, it's really hard to win a national election.
That's almost tautological from that standpoint. But I would suggest to you that holding hearings and see what it appears to be is these guys didn't want they were scared to actually vote. You know, they had the votes to defeat the nomination if they wanted to. They would have had the stronger appearance of fairness, considerations for America, the thoughts on. But you know what? They were scared themselves to vote. So that's and voting them down does the same thing for the base as otherwise.
Yeah, I agree with that. That could be true as well. I did have one more question though, Will.
Go ahead, Mike.
One thing I wanted to ask you, and I haven't had a chance to ask this to many people that are as well versed in the Constitution. One of the things that I think, one of the bigger problems and one of the reasons we've gotten away from the Constitution is because senators are now elected by the popular vote instead of by the state legislatures. And I just wanted to get your input on whether you think that has a major role to play in why we are where we are now and what we can do maybe to get it back to the way it was before.
The 17th Amendment was probably the largest disaster in the history of the country because there was a carefully constructed balance of differing interests that were represented in Washington. And representing when the senators were appointed by the states, representing the states as states, and many of whom considered their senators to be subject to even recall, then if the senators were still appointed by states, would we have unfunded mandates? You know, if the senators were appointed by states, would we have in the state that would we be worrying so much about state rights being infringed upon? You're absolutely correct. The biggest because what happened was you made senators responsible to the same pressures as House of Representatives. There's essentially no difference between the House of Representatives and the Senate.
Let me interject really quickly, David, and ask you a quick question on that. Wasn't it intended that the senators were to act as ambassadors from their states to the federal government? I mean, wasn't that what was intended? That I don't want to say foreign governments, but to a degree sovereign governments that were represented in the federal government, correct? That they were to meet. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're actually correct, Will. That was fully the intention. The states, as states, were expected to have a say-so in the legislation that would be passed. And when you made everybody responsible to the same electorate, then you wind up with the same situation where senators can win re-election by what? Giving away as much stuff as they can.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
So in a
by
way,
bringing home the bacon.
that's a huge problem are those federal mandates with all the strings attached. Absolutely. And I mean, you look, the states don't. A lot of some of these states have the balanced budget amendments, and by law have to balance their budget. And the federal government doesn't have to balance its budget, and it has the power to print money. So they dangle these things, the carrots in front of them, and the governors have a really hard time saying no because the federal government's taxing them and saying, "Hey, we're going to give you some of your money back." It's
Here,
really hard politically to say no to that.
the 21st Amendment gives states literally direct power over regulation of alcoholic beverages.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when they repealed prohibition, they gave that power directly to the states, i.e., even things like whether or not what level of alcohol consumption designates you as impaired.
Mm-hmm.
This whole situation where the federal government says, well, unless you take your designation to 0.08 from 0.10, and otherwise, if you don't do that, you're free to not do that because that's not within our power. But you know what it is? If you don't do that, we're not going to give you any money to build your roads. These kinds of things are crazy. Would that happen if the Senate was appointed by the states? Absolutely not.
I have a question I think that is good timing right now. There's also a process for a constitutional convention, and it's never happened, obviously. I think 6 states so far have signed on, but another 28 would be needed to actually make it reality. Is that something that is ever going to happen? I mean, clearly it would bypass some of the problems we're discussing. It would go right around Congress, and the states would have a say. And I don't know how many states have, the type of, let's say, do we have 34 states that have Republican or Democrat majority that would sign on to something like this? I mean, it seems almost impossible these days to actually get a constitutional amendment approved. Is this a possible solution, or at least some way to actually make something happen that it will be in the state's benefits?
There's 3 of those different projects moving forward. I actually am a consultant to Heartland Institute on the Article 5 movement. I'm one of their consultants. They have a large group. But there's three movements for that. One's called the Convention of States. One's a group called the Balanced Budget Amendment Group. The third is a group called the Compact for America. And there are the Balanced Budget Amendment people, depending on how you count, could be as close as 5 or 6 states away from having a balanced budget amendment, having a convention called for the purpose of proposing a balanced budget amendment. Convention of States is a more broader-based thing to put together an open kind of convention to propose a series of amendments, some of which are made famous by Mark Levine's book that he talks about. The
Liberty amendments.
The Liberty amendments, there we go. Mm-hmm. And the third one is called the Compact for America, and a friend of mine by the name of Nick Dranius, who's from the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, is one of the prime activists in that. And I used to do a radio show. Nick was a guest on my show. We had a long discussion about this. The Compact for America is a very interesting approach to this because it overcomes most of the questions and the objections that people have to what they boogeyman things about possible runaway conventions and conventions that might propose doing away with the First Amendment, all kinds of horrible things. Because the Compact of America puts together a whole structure that has the states actually agree beforehand what they're going to be involved in. And I think Nick's group has 6 or 7 folks already.
Let me clarify. The delegates that they send to the convention by law are beholden to whatever that the state legislatures want them to vote on. Correct?
Yes.
Because there's a large contingency saying that this could be a runaway convention. You have the Birchers and 10th Amendment Center people saying it's a runaway convention. It's a new constitutional convention. They're going to draft a new constitution. So, and I'm sure some of the people that will watch this will think the same thing, that these delegates will just vote on a whim and will lose constitutional rights, and to them, it's virtually, they think it's the end of the republic. What do you think?
Certainly not. In the first instance, of course, you need the 34 states to agree to have the convention. But all the convention gets to do is propose amendments. After that, it goes through the normal ratification process that involves 37 states.
So just to clarify, it's a convention of the states to propose amendments, not create another constitution, correct?
That's exactly correct. It's a convention of states to propose amendments, not to create a new constitution.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard these objections, and are these, and some of them come from originalists. Are they? I mean, are they federalists? I mean, as an originalist, don't you espouse federalism, the rights of the sovereign states to have some autonomy in the government? And that George Mason, who insisted on this amendment, was an anti-federalist, and he worried about a tyrannical Congress, and that's why they built this back door in for the states to propose amendments to the Constitution. I don't understand where their concerns are really coming from. Is there something I'm missing?
I don't think so, Will. I don't get most of the objections. Although anybody's going to point out any big objection, of course, the convention in 1787 was
right.
Theoretically to propose amendments to the.
They say that all the time.
And those guys proposed the new Constitution, but the new Constitution didn't go into effect until it was ratified and agreed to by the rest of the proposed states. They continue to operate under the Articles. So any proposals that would come out of such a convention still need to be ratified by 37 individual states, individual ratifications. So it doesn't. It still has to go through the ratification process even after. They could propose repeal in the First Amendment. Are you going to get 37 states to do that? I doubt it. It's not going to happen.
I have a
Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
So let's just say theoretically that an Article 5 convention was convened for a balanced budget amendment. Now, they're not limited at the convention to only considering a balanced budget amendment, aren't they? I mean, they can propose any amendment they want as long as the convention's convened, can't they?
That's my opinion. There are extremely knowledgeable folks who studied it a great deal who have said that they would be limited to the terms of the petitions that they sent to Congress that caused the convention to be called. Okay, and that's one of the ways, because of course by some counts there's been over 750 some odd petitions to Congress to call a constitutional convention. Congress has ignored them. Congress has not historically had a way to collect them and count them. People argue about issues of how good a petition. Because here's the process. There's two processes to amend the Constitution. One is an amendment proposed by 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, ratified by 3/4 of the states. The other one is when the convention is called by the states, but the states call the convention via petitions, sending in petitions to Congress, and when they reach that magic number, the interesting thing is the Constitution says Congress shall call a convention. It doesn't give Congress an option to do so. It says they shall. Now, are the delegates free to do what they wish once they're at the convention? I would suggest that historically, conventions that were called and what the meaning was of a convention when they were called was the delegate had authority that was given to him by the people that appointed him. So if the people, whatever directions, if the state of California sent 6 delegates, whatever they sent, they would be bound by whatever directions they got from the state of California. And if the state of California decided they weren't following, they could recall them.
Okay.
I have a question regarding why we're even discussing an Article 5 convention, or why are the states doing this? And it gets back to our point that we were talking about earlier, is this notion of consolidated government, along with the 17th Amendment, that you're starting to get this more consolidated democracy. There are no differences between how the Congress is elected. Congress, which was originally the only popularly elected body in the federal government. Obviously, the House was originally the only popularly, I cannot speak, elected portion of the federal government. Now it's the Senate, and there's virtually no difference. The Senate really does not represent the state legislatures or the state governments anymore. So you
No.
kind of had this more of a central authority, more of this consolidated government. Isn't that exactly what the framers feared? I mean, would the Constitution be ratified if that was the case today? By the
Absolutely not. It would not have been ratified if that were the case today, because
but don't we live in a democracy? Isn't this a democracy where the collective vote and it's the majority rules? I mean, isn't that what the framers had intended?
No, the framers indicated that democracy was basically two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for dinner. You'd have and you know how that vote's going to come out, right? So yeah, that's exactly and spread power around. Mm-hmm. And so they created different constituencies so that the House would be representing the people directly, the states would be represented by the members of the Senate, and then the president would represent the nation as a whole. So there was, and they all served different terms, so that they would not coincide with one another, and they all were selected by different processes. And so and that was the same thing with by making the court have a different selection process. So but by making a full third of the government, actually 2/3 of the government the same. One of the worst things, we go back to the 17th Amendment, one of the worst things about the Senate was not only the unfunded mandate situation, but the fact that we're talking about Supreme Court vacancies right now. If the Senate were appointed by states, then the president would be nominating different members of the Supreme Court than he nominates now. The Senate is part and parcel of the federal government, and so consequently, what are they going to approve? They're going to approve justices who approve the expansion of the Senate's power. So it's a terribly vicious cycle that got started by the 17th Amendment.
Okay, now let me ask you one. I'm going to ask you one question. You can give me a yes or no on it, and then I have a question right after that. Sometimes on the show, actually, I describe the U.S. kind of as a soft tyranny at this point. That we don't have this checks and balances that were intended. We no longer have the separation of powers. Would you agree?
No, we don't even have a two-party system. All we have are the folks in charge.
Right.
So we just have the folks in charge, and frankly, we don't even have. It's nice to think and hope that we're going to have an election and it's going to change a variety of things, but who are the folks that run things? The bureaucrats.
Yeah. Yep. And that's where I'm getting to now. I mean, I think it was de Tocqueville that described it as democratic despotism. I can't remember. I read de Tocqueville a long time ago. I don't remember if it was Jefferson or de Tocqueville, but I'm pretty sure it was de Tocqueville that described it as democratic despotism. And I think we're moving slightly in that direction. But here's my question: is that we largely blame, I call it a Constitution in the breach. We largely blame the Supreme Court for this. A lot of their rulings. But who seldom gets blamed are the executive and Congress, who has delegated an awful lot of powers to Congress through through the administrative state specifically, and that they are taking rulemaking powers. The court with Scalia on it has shot down a lot of these administration, these bureaucracies within the executive branch. But it seems that they're kind of like, the checks and balances have been completely eroded, and that, to a degree, the executive is engaging in lawmaking powers. And Congress has just openly delegated these powers to the president. And Congress, if you even mention checking the executive or defunding some of these things, like the Department of Education or the IRS or the SEC, you're branded as this constitutional. You're a purist. You're an extremist. You know what I mean? So if you go against this democratic despotic tide, you're labeled as a nut. Am I on to something here? Can you hear him? Oh, got it. I can hear. Sorry.
Nope.
No, I can't.
We lost your audio, David.
How are we now?
We're good. Got it.
There you
Okay.
go.
Do you need me to ask the question again?
No, I heard you.
Okay.
I heard you just fine. But I'll tell you a little story. I was going down to Ave Maria University in Southwest Florida to give a talk on Constitution Day, and I went to get a haircut. And before I went to get a haircut, my wife gave me specific instructions on where, do this, do that, make sure it's squared off in the back, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to there and I was talking to the woman that was giving me a haircut. And she said, "Boy, you're really doing it." I said, "Well, I got specific instructions and I'm giving this talk. I'm going to be in front of 300 or 400 people, et cetera, et cetera." She says, "What about?" I said, "I'm giving a talk about the Constitution." And she says to me, she says, "Boy, it's really too bad that our leaders don't follow that anymore." And I looked at her and I said, "And whose fault is that?"
Yeah.
And she sheepishly came back and said, "Ours.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Ours."
You're right.
And so
And isn't that the purpose of your book? Is to get this information out there?
that's the purpose of constitutional soundbites, is to hopefully let people understand that, yeah, it's the law, it's there to protect us, but with important rights come important responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So while you have rights, you also have duties. You have duties and responsibilities, and so I think that we have no one but ourselves to blame.
Right. So if somebody, I heard somebody say at one point, I don't remember. If somebody has a right, someone has an obligation, right?
Well,
If I have a
yes
right
and no.
to if I have a right to property, the state has an obligation to protect my right to property.
That's what they're there for.
Mhm.
That's what they're there
That's
for.
what the whole purpose of
The state has obligations.
Mm-hmm.
People have rights.
Yes.
In some situations, they have duties. But of course, regarding the right vis-a-vis each other, I think earlier today you and I were talking. You mentioned Bastiat, and one of my favorite quotes from him is, "The right of my fist ends at the tip of your nose."
Yeah.
So you have a right to extend your fist, but you don't have a right to hit my nose.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an obligation and a duty that comes with everything.
That's very true. Yeah. So I mean,
But
yeah.
are you right? So who has abdicated their rights?
The sovereign people really have.
That's exactly the case.
And then the thing is though is that I specifically write a lot about constitutional law and originalism, and people generally their eyes glaze over, they don't care, and basically what they know about the Constitution is from Everson or Brown v. Board, or its jurisprudence. There's the wall, the separation between church and state. You hear this all the time. No one understands the Establishment Clause. You can explain it 7 ways from Sunday. You're the extreme. You're a religious extremist if you explain it. Never do you get an argument. So I don't. The people. You're right. The people have willingly done it. But is it out of the desire to have a greater, stronger, more consolidated state, or is it out of just pure ignorance?
Can I just chime in for a second?
Please.
Because I actually bought your book today, the first volume of it, and I really appreciate it because, like I said at the outset when we were talking before the show, I'm not a constitutional scholar like Will is, and to have it presented so succinctly and in such small fragments that made so much more sense than having to go through some heavy tome. Really, I mean, it sort of spoke to me, and I think the reason what Will is saying about people abdicating their role is that not necessarily doing it through any sort of malice, but more from the fact that it can be hard to take in, and people have different jobs, and you have a day-to-day crunch, and so you don't have time really, and maybe the last time you heard anything about the Constitution was in high school or something. So, I think it's simply a problem of people not having the time or the motivation in their daily lives to understand the Constitution, or other issues of economics. We talk about that a lot too, and people don't understand economics either. So I loved your book, and I just want to say thanks for that.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that commentary. I have to tell you that I mentioned at the outset that I spent longer as a beer guy than I spent as a lawyer, and I've always tried to make these things non-lawyerly. One of the when I was doing my radio show, and we used to do promos for the show and called the Constitutional Minute, and so I would just put a concise thought about the Constitution in a minute as a promotion for the show. And I started to collect those, and then I developed them into a book, and I used many non-lawyer editors for my writing because we have a habit, unfortunately, of falling into the thing. But the truth is what I tried to do, two things. Well, I tried to use two models. One was, of course, Thomas Paine. In terms of, he said, common sense was the name of his book, right? In 6 months, nobody had mentioned independence before that. In 6 months after he talked common sense, they voted for independence. He issued the book in January of '76, and July 4th they voted for independence. And some years after writing the Declaration of Independence, they asked Thomas Jefferson what he was trying to achieve, and he said, I'm just trying to explain the common sense of the matter. And that's actually all we're trying to do too. People obfuscate, people make it more complicated, people turn it into things that aren't there. They're doing it for their own personal political purposes. And the Constitution is really not as necessarily complex as it's presented. And that's what we tried to do with Constitutional Soundbites, was turn it into. And besides that, you say people don't have time. People are used to blog posts and tweets and things like that, and so we tried to make it so it's.
Can you do this in 140 characters, please, David? I want you to put all this into 140 characters. Actually, 130 and then a hashtag. That'd be great.
Well, actually, I'm down to 132. Or no, actually, I'm down to 130 because with @Shestokas, I've already lost 10 characters.
All right, so it just makes you stronger, all that stuff,
Yeah.
But we do that all the time. I mean, that's sort of our job is to condense a topic or an issue into a very short bite. And it's interesting on our pages. If we even post something that has sort of the length of just like a newspaper article, people don't read it. That's too long. That's too much for people. You really have to have 1 or 2 paragraphs, and then you get all these eyeballs on it. And I think that's, do I think that means people are stupid or anything like that? No, but I think like you've correctly identified, there's a market for something that's quick and that can get to the point.
Well, we hope so. We hope to share this education and just make people think, make people understand that it's the law. Hopefully, they'll understand that it's a gift that we were given. It's a gift that
Absolutely.
we were given. And not to give it away or let it go.
David, can you do me a favor? I'm sorry, Kevin. I want to get this on air. Can you do a favor and tell the viewers where they can get your book?
It's at Amazon.com.
Okay.
It's very simple, Constitutional Soundbites. And, of course, you can find out more about Constitutional Soundbites on my site, which is Shestokas.com, which is SHESTOKAS.com. But if you Google Constitutional Soundbites, you'll find that pretty easily, And please follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to get to 90,000. I've got 89,500 followers. So there's people that are interested in this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you work with the Heartland Institute every once in a while?
Every once in a while, I do some things. I've got some consulting that I do with the Heartland Institute, but I'm also do some things with in June coming up. I'm talking to the Young Latino Leadership Summit put on by Turning Point down in Orlando. We're talking. I might mention it's also available. The Spanish version came out before the final English, which was interesting. I worked with a Spanish professor who herself was a Cuban immigrant for almost a year to take 18th century English and turn it into 21st century Spanish. And strangely enough, There are 36 million Americans who are more comfortable in Spanish. I don't care if you're bilingual or not. To get important ideas, you need them in your native language. I'll tell you a little backstory on we'll go back to the old white guys. This story's in the book. But September 17th, 1787, they had finished drafting the Constitution. They sent it out to be ratified, and they had to put it around to all the states. And send, it was taking a while to get out to New York and down to Georgia and et cetera, et cetera. But Independence Hall at the time was also, which is where they drafted the Constitution in Philadelphia, was also the seat of the Pennsylvania legislature. So all they had to do with the Constitution was walk it upstairs. So they walked it upstairs to the Pennsylvania legislature. The Pennsylvania legislature ordered 4,500 copies of the Constitution for distribution around Pennsylvania, so that people could understand what the proposed new government was about. But only 3,000 of those copies that the Pennsylvania legislature ordered were in English. 1,500 were in German. Fully 1/3 of the population of Pennsylvania in 1787 did not speak English. And it was critical and important to these old white guys, right? To those old white guys that didn't care.
Xenophobic, egocentric white guys.
Xenophobic, ethnocentric.
Ethnocentric, any of those other academic words that sound important but are largely vacuous.
Yeah. It was important to these horrible guys that the people who didn't speak English understood what the proposed Constitution was about, and they involved the German-speaking population. Shortly thereafter, the Constitution was circulated in New York. For folks that may or may not remember, before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. And they did the same thing in New York, but they published the constitutions in Dutch. Mm-hmm. And so we do a disservice to our fellow Hispanic Americans who are more comfortable in English, or more comfortable in Spanish, because it's one thing to go out and hold down your job and learn and do your banking and order food in a restaurant. It's a whole other thing to understand first principles. It's a whole other thing to understand la vida, la libertad y búsqueda de felicidad.
There you go. It's a good point. Very good point. I never really thought of that. I know Kevin's chomping at the bit here. He's got another question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin, and then we'll get Mike in there again, because we're running close. We're running out of time. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, sure. I'm more of a comment. I wanted to get your opinion on. And Will alluded to this earlier, but I've always had the feeling that sort of the weak link in our system has, in terms of the debasing of the Constitution, has been the courts and their ability to essentially to rewrite legislation, to interfere with the other branches of government. Do you agree with that as well? I know you talked about it a little bit earlier, but
our courts dangerous in that respect? Absolutely.
So are they the weak link? Are they the reason? I mean, really, our Constitution has gotten so far away from its original intent and its original meaning. I tend to ascribe that to the justice to courts.
I will tell you that one of the things that's horrible in academia and horrible in law school is they don't teach the Constitution. They teach constitutional law, which are two completely different things. If people understood the Constitution, you're right, they would be rolling over and being extraordinarily unhappy with these things. Because this whole book is about the Constitution, right? But I think there might be 3 Supreme Court opinions that I mention in there, because that's what they are, they're opinions. And the important thing is, if we don't understand what it was meant when it was written, then or don't live by what it was when it was written, then it's not law. It's just Moses didn't say it was the 10 suggestions. It said it was the 10 Commandments, and these were not the equivalent of the 10 suggestions. These were the equivalent of the 10 Commandments, and you don't rewrite honor thy father and thy mother.
Pretty sure I saw Congress. We suggest Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I'm pretty sure that's in there.
Yeah, we suggest they shall make no law. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
Mike,
We,
I'm sorry.
uh,
I'm sorry, David. Mike, go ahead before we got to wrap it up.
yeah.
All right.
Did you say me?
Yeah. Do you have any questions? That you look like you might have had one.
Well, the one question I wanted to ask him before we cut out here, the one thing I want to get in is if he had any ideas himself. I know we talked a little about the Liberty amendments and just anything that we can do, whether it's an Article 5 convention, a balanced budget amendment. Do you have any recommendations for how we can kind of get back to the original intent of the Constitution?
The easiest one, the one that was the biggest destruction, was the 17th Amendment. The easiest suggestion to make would be to repeal the 17th Amendment.
I agree.
Is it politically saleable? People have to be sold on the idea. You have to overcome the idea that's told to them that it's so much better than to elect your senator that you can then make him responsive. But if you think about it, your senator actually was at one time representative to your responsive to your state representative. And is it easier to talk to your state representative than your senator? Yeah. But the quickest fix is to put back in place that balance, because that balance also destroyed the courts. The destruction of the balance also destroyed the courts, because it made senators approve judges who approved expansion of federal power. Mm-hmm. Expansion of federal power. Right after when the expansion started to take place, during Franklin Roosevelt, who had big arguments with the court, right? Those were the first sets of justices that started upholding Roosevelt, were the first sets of justices that were approved by senators mm-hmm. who had been elected under the new system. So you can see the approval of the growth of the administrative state take place once the senators started approving judges that would approve it.
All right. That pretty much wraps up the show. I just want to mention that next week, which is the 6th, what's today? Yeah, the 6th, it's the 6th. We have James Swanson on, who is a Lincoln historian, also a lawyer, wrote a few books on Lincoln himself, and works with the Heritage Foundation. We're going to debunk some of the libertarian myths about Lincoln. I'm looking forward to that show. I want to thank David for coming on. It was an excellent show. There's a lot of information there, and I want to implore you to buy his book. It will give you excellent information, to line your armory against leftist living constitution proponents. And again, follow him on Twitter. You can find him easily. I Google searched him right after I met him. It was easy to find him, and I also did other creepy things on there. I looked at I tried to find you wherever I could, David. I hope that's not weird.
I think that probably kept you busy.
Yeah, I was Google Earth in your house. I saw you had a little dog. I hope that's not weird or anything. But please.
I was going to ask him to come back on, but that's not going to
happen. Please, follow Unbiased America. We are capitalists. Being classically liberal, who had their page stolen for a little bit of time, but they got it back, so you can go back and like them. And look forward to seeing you next week. And David, you can stay on for just a second after I go off the air so we can talk briefly. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.